They say that wild mustangs never approach humans unless something greater than instinct calls them forward. And on that cold autumn morning in Wyoming's wilderness, a striking dun-colored Mustang with a dark stripe running down its spine appeared at the edge of a rundown ranch. Its eyes weren't just the usual wild, wary eyes of a free horse. There was something ancient in them, something that held the weight of years of watching and waiting. It was as if the animal knew something Mason Riley, a battle-worn Army Ranger, didn't yet understand. As the Mustang stood there, unmoving, watching him, Mason felt something stir inside of him. The kind of stir that didn't come from logic or reason, but from a deeper, more instinctive place, one he hadn't visited in a long time. He had just buried his grandfather, Samuel Riley, the man who had raised him after his parents' death, and now, standing at the edge of the old ranch, Mason didn't know what to feel. There was the grief of losing the last family he had, the weight of a lifetime of memories wrapped up in the walls of this old place, and yet there was this sudden sense of something else, something pulling him forward. Without even thinking, Mason stepped off the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel as he moved toward the broken fence where the Mustang stood. The wind carried the scent of pine and the promise of winter, the sky still streaked with the remnants of night. A strange energy hung in the air, like a storm was brewing, though the sky was clear. The Mustang's gaze locked onto his, and Mason felt an inexplicable pull, as though the horse was waiting for him to take the first step. Slowly, carefully, Mason closed the distance between them, his breath coming in small clouds in the chilly morning air. "Where'd you come from?" he asked, his voice low, unsure whether he was speaking to the horse or to the emptiness that seemed to echo in the space around him. The Mustang didn't bolt, didn't turn and run as Mason expected. Instead, the animal did something Mason couldn't have predicted. It knelt on the ground, once, twice, as if beckoning him closer. It was a gesture that should have been impossible for a wild animal, but there it was, an invitation that Mason felt he couldn't refuse. Mason had grown up around horses. His grandfather had been a skilled trainer, and though Samuel had gotten older, more frail over the years, his love for the land, the ranch, and the animals never wavered. Wild horses like the Mustang, however, didn't come near humans unless they were injured, lost, or desperate. But this one, this Mustang, seemed different. It wasn't hungry, it wasn't hurt, and it wasn't lost. It was just waiting. Mason reached out slowly, offering his hand, trying to let the animal see he wasn't a threat. The Mustang's eyes softened, and for a moment Mason could swear the horse was looking into his soul. There was no fear in those eyes, no hesitation, only a quiet understanding. Mason took another step forward, and to his surprise, the Mustang didn't move. Instead, it tossed its head back, its dark mane fluttering in the breeze. It wasn't the wild, unpredictable behavior Mason had expected. No, it was something deeper. The horse didn't just stand there. It was patient, almost as if it knew exactly what Mason needed, even though Mason had no idea what he was doing here or what he was meant to find. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the Mustang turned and began walking back into the trees. It paused at the edge of the forest, looking back over its shoulder at Mason, as if to see if he would follow. Mason stood there, his heart racing. Every fiber of his being screamed that it was crazy, that he had no business following some wild animal into the woods, especially when he had so much to do at the ranch. But as he stood there, watching the Mustang's silhouette blend into the shadows of the pines, something inside him shifted. The grief, the loneliness, the weight of all that had been lost. It didn't feel so heavy in that moment. It felt like there was something waiting for him, something that had been set in motion long before he ever arrived at Whispering Pines. Without another thought, Mason took a step forward, and then another. He didn't know what he was walking toward. There was no map, no plan, no guide except for the wild horse ahead of him. But as he moved deeper into the woods, following the Mustang's steady pace, Mason felt a strange kind of peace wash over him, as though the forest itself was embracing him. The scent of pine trees and damp earth filled his lungs. The only sound the soft crunch of his boots against the forest floor and the occasional call of a jaybird in the distance. The world around him seemed to fall away, and for the first time in weeks he wasn't thinking about the funeral, or the house that now felt empty, or the memories of the war that haunted his nights. He was simply walking, simply following, letting the Mustang guide him deeper into the forest, as if it had been waiting for him all along. It wasn't long before Mason realized that the Mustang wasn't just leading him through the forest, it was leading him somewhere, to something. The forest was thick with trees, their trunks towering and old, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands, but the path ahead was clear. The Mustang moved with purpose, its hooves steady on the soft ground, as if it knew exactly where it was going. Mason's mind raced with questions. Why was the Mustang here? What was it trying to show him? But there were no answers, only the rhythm of his steps and the steady pace of the horse ahead. The wind began to pick up, the trees swaying above him, and just as he thought he couldn't go any further, the trees suddenly parted. Ahead of him was a small clearing, and in the center of it, hidden among the pines, was an old cabin. It wasn't much to look at. Its roof sagged, the walls weathered and worn from years of neglect, but something about it called to him. It felt familiar, like a place he had seen in a dream, or perhaps in his grandfather's stories. The Mustang stopped at the edge of the clearing, its dark eyes still fixed on Mason, as if waiting for him to take the next step. Mason moved forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know why, but he felt compelled to approach. The air was colder now, the scent of pine sharper, and the silence of the forest felt heavier, more charged, like something was about to happen. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew he couldn't turn back. Not now. And as he reached the cabin, pushing open the door with a gentle creak, Mason had no idea that what he would find inside would change everything. The cabin stood before him, its dilapidated structure seemingly untouched by time. Yet there was something about it that felt alive, like it had been waiting for this moment. Mason hesitated at the threshold, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air as he stood just inside the door, peering into the dim interior. The smell of dust and something else, something ancient, lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of pine that still clung to his jacket from the forest. The space was small, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight, and the only light came from the weak sun filtering through gaps in the walls. It wasn't much of a cabin, but the stillness inside held a kind of quiet reverence, as if it was a sacred place, holding secrets long buried. Mason's eyes moved over the few pieces of furniture that had managed to endure the years. An old cot, a small wooden table, and the faded remnants of a life that had once been vibrant. As he stepped further in, his boots heavy on the floor, a raspy cough echoed from the far corner. He froze. "Samuel, is that you, old friend?" the voice called weakly from the shadows. Mason's heart stopped, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis, and his legs threatened to buckle beneath him. The voice was frail, yet there was an unmistakable recognition in it, the kind of recognition that only a few people would ever know. A deep part of Mason knew this wasn't some stranger calling out to him. It was someone who had known his grandfather, someone who had shared more than just space in this cabin. They had shared memories, battles, and a life Mason had never truly understood until this very moment. The frail figure in the corner shifted slightly, struggling to sit up on the narrow cot. Despite his condition, the old man's eyes were sharp, alert, the kind of eyes that had seen too much in life and had learned to hold secrets within their depths. His skin was thin, almost translucent, his face gaunt and pale, but there was a strength behind his gaze that Mason couldn't ignore. "Samuel, I knew you'd come back," the man rasped, his voice crackling like dry leaves in the wind. Mason swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He couldn't bring himself to speak, but his feet moved instinctively toward the cot, drawn by the undeniable pull of this strange connection. "I'm not Samuel," Mason finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "My name's Mason Riley. I'm his grandson." The old man blinked, his eyes narrowing with a mix of confusion and recognition. His breathing was shallow, labored, and Mason could see the effort it took for him to focus, to make sense of what was happening. And then, as if the fog of confusion lifted for just a moment, the old man's face softened. A slow, tired smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "Mason Riley, of course." He paused, a harsh cough shaking his frail body before continuing. "Samuel always spoke of you. He always talked about you, you know. Thought the world of you, that boy. Thought you'd come back here one day." Mason's heart tightened in his chest. He had never truly understood the depth of his grandfather's love for him. Samuel had raised him, taught him how to handle the ranch, how to survive, how to be strong. But it had always been done quietly, with little fanfare, never truly expressing just how much he meant to him. The realization hit Mason like a freight train. Samuel had been preparing for this moment, for Mason to find Thomas Winters, the man lying in front of him now, the man who had fought beside Samuel in the jungles of Vietnam, a medic who had saved Samuel's life more times than Mason could count. And now, after all these years, Thomas was here, alone, dying in this forgotten cabin, while the world had moved on without him. Mason knelt beside the cot, his hands instinctively reaching out to steady Thomas, to offer comfort. "I'm sorry," Mason said, his voice rough with emotion. I didn't know you were here. I didn't know any of this." The words felt clumsy, inadequate, but it was all he could say. Thomas had been here, alone, all this time. Samuel had been coming to visit him, Mason realized. Samuel had been checking on his old friend, bringing him supplies, even as his own health had begun to fail. Thomas's condition was dire, his breathing ragged, his body frail and withered by time, but there was something in his eyes that refused to give in. This man, this soldier, had survived horrors that Mason could never imagine, but it seemed that now, at the end of his life, he wasn't ready to face it alone. Thomas's hand reached out weakly, and Mason gently took it, his fingers closing around the old man's fragile wrist. "It's been a long time since Samuel came to see me," Thomas whispered, his eyes distant. "Last time he came, we talked about the old days, about Vietnam, about the things we saw, the things we did. He kept saying he was going to bring you here. He knew you would come back." Mason's mind was spinning, the weight of it all pressing down on him. The forest, the Mustang, Thomas's arrival, all of it seemed connected in ways he couldn't explain. "You and my grandfather, you fought together?" Mason asked quietly, his voice thick with curiosity, but more than that, with a deep, gnawing need to understand. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, his breathing rattling in his chest. When he opened them again, the memories were there, swimming in the depths of his gaze. "Yeah," he rasped. "We were brothers, not by blood, but by fire. He saved my life more times than I can count. In Vietnam, he pulled me out of hell more times than I deserved. I owe him everything." He paused, the rasping breath catching in his throat. "He was the best man I ever knew. Never told anyone, never talked about it, but he carried the weight of those days, that war, for the rest of his life. Never let anyone see it, though." Mason felt his throat constrict as he listened to Thomas's words. He had known his grandfather to be a quiet, reserved man, never speaking much of his time in the military, never mentioning the things he had seen or done. But hearing Thomas's words, the weight of them, made Mason realize just how much of that burden Samuel had carried alone. How much of it had stayed buried, even as he raised Mason, tried to give him a life outside of the war. "I never knew," Mason said softly, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know any of this." Thomas's gaze softened. "Samuel wanted to protect you, from all of it, from the pain, the memories. He didn't want you to carry it, Mason, but sometimes it's not a choice. You have to carry what's left. That's what he did. And now, it's your turn." Mason's chest tightened as the words sank in. Thomas had been living in this cabin alone for years, isolated from the world, waiting for the end. And now Mason was here, still struggling to understand his place in all of it. But one thing was certain, he wasn't alone anymore. He had found Thomas just as his grandfather had planned, and now it was Mason's turn to take care of the men who had once taken care of him. As Mason sat beside the cot, his hand still resting gently in Thomas's, he realized that this journey, this strange, inexplicable pull that had led him to this forgotten cabin in the forest, was more than just about the past. It was about healing, about honoring the bonds between soldiers, between brothers. It was about carrying forward the legacy of a man who had given everything. And now Mason knew it was his turn to do the same. Mason sat on the edge of the cot, his fingers still gently gripping Thomas's frail hand, as the old man's labored breathing filled the room. The weight of the moment was almost too much to bear. Everything Mason had known about his life, about his purpose, his past, was unraveling before him, and he wasn't sure whether to be angry, sad, or just numb. All of it felt like a strange, surreal dream that he couldn't wake from, as if this forgotten cabin had become a place outside time where the world's harsh truths didn't quite seem to apply. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the branches of the towering pines that surrounded the clearing. The scent of damp earth and pine needles clung to the air, mingling with the musty smell of the cabin, and for a moment it was as though the world had come to a halt. There was no sound except for the whispering wind and the faint, rhythmic rasping of Thomas's breath. "I'm not going to make it much longer, Mason," Thomas said suddenly, his voice weak but steady, as though he had finally come to terms with the truth that had been hanging in the air since Mason first stepped into this place. "I don't have many days left, but your grandfather, he wanted to make sure you understood." He paused, his breath rattling again as his tired eyes met Mason's, eyes that held a depth of pain and wisdom that only years of survival could impart. He didn't just want to keep you away from the war, from all of it. He wanted you to understand that sometimes it's not the fighting that breaks you. It's the not knowing what to do with all of it after the fight is over. The words hung in the air like a confession, a burden shared between two men who had never before spoken of such things. He wanted to protect you from the weight of it all, Mason, from carrying things that no one should have to carry. Mason felt his throat tighten as the truth of Thomas's words settled over him. His grandfather, the quiet, steadfast man who had raised him with an iron grip and a steady heart, had never spoken of his time in Vietnam. He had kept everything buried, hidden away in letters, in brief mentions, in the long silences that filled their conversations. Samuel Riley had never asked for anything, had never shared the dark burdens he'd carried through the years, but Mason now understood that it wasn't out of pride or stubbornness. It was because he had carried those burdens, for the two of them had borne the weight of his past alone, so that Mason wouldn't have to. Mason's eyes burned with unshed tears, but he blinked them back, unwilling to show weakness in front of Thomas, the man who had fought beside his grandfather all those years ago. "Where do I even start?" Mason whispered, more to himself than to Thomas, the confusion in his voice betraying the chaos he felt inside. His mind raced with the weight of everything he had just learned, of everything that had been hidden for so long. "What am I supposed to do with all this now?" Thomas chuckled weakly, the sound a mere rasp against his throat, but there was a hint of warmth behind it. "Start by taking care of the ranch, Mason. It's yours now, after all. Start by taking care of this place, of the men who fought beside Samuel." He paused, his hand tightening around Mason's. "He knew it would be you. He knew it would be you who'd come back. That's why he left everything to you." Mason shook his head, the weight of the responsibility settling heavier in his chest. The ranch, the land, the memories, it was all too much, too overwhelming. But as Thomas's frail voice continued, Mason began to feel something deep inside stir, a sense of purpose that had been buried under years of military service and personal loss. Maybe this was what he had been running from for so long. Maybe this was the place, the legacy, that had been waiting for him all this time. "Samuel always said the Mustang would bring you home," Thomas said, his voice growing quieter, weaker as he spoke. "He always said that horse would find its way to you when the time was right." Mason's head snapped up, his heart pounding in his chest. "The Mustang? You mean the wild horse I saw outside?" Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes half-lidded as though the effort of speaking was draining him. "Yeah, that Mustang's been around these parts for years. Always appears when it's needed most. Samuel thought it was... well, he thought it was a guardian of sorts, something watching over us." Mason frowned, still trying to wrap his mind around what Thomas was saying. "So it's not just a coincidence? That horse led me here?" Thomas's lips curled into a weak smile. "Nothing about this place is a coincidence, Mason. You're here for a reason. The Mustang didn't just find you, it was always going to find you. You just didn't know it yet." Mason stood up, his legs stiff from the long hours spent at Thomas's side. He walked slowly to the cabin door, his gaze drifting across the clearing outside. The forest stood still, the trees swaying ever so slightly in the breeze, their shadows stretching long in the fading light. He could almost hear the Mustang's call in the distance, a low whinny that seemed to echo through the trees. It was like the horse was waiting for him to step forward, to make the next move. For the first time since he arrived at Whispering Pines, Mason felt something shift inside him, a sense of clarity, a deep knowing that he couldn't ignore. His grandfather had prepared him for this moment, prepared him to take up the mantle of leadership, to care for the ranch, and to honor the bonds of brotherhood that had been formed long ago. Samuel had known that Mason would come back to this place, that he would find Thomas, and that he would be the one to carry on the legacy of the men who had fought together, suffered together, and survived together. The weight of it all still hung heavy on his shoulders, but as Mason looked out at the towering trees, at the land that had once been his grandfather's life, he realized something. Maybe he didn't have all the answers. Maybe he didn't know how to fix everything that was broken, or how to heal the wounds that had been left behind. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was running anymore. He was here, and that was enough. Turning back to Thomas, Mason's voice was quiet but firm. "I'll take care of it. I'll take care of the ranch, and I'll make sure you get home. I promise." Thomas's smile softened, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know you will, Mason. You're ready. Just don't forget what's important." His breath faltered as he tried to sit up again, but the effort was too much, and he sank back onto the cot. "Make sure the Mustang stays. Make sure it's there for the others when they need it. And make sure you remember who you are. This place, it has a way of making you forget." Mason nodded, his mind already turning over the words, the promise. The Mustang, Thomas's words, his grandfather's plan. It all seemed to be part of something larger than he could comprehend. But for now, he didn't need to understand it all. He just needed to do what was right. And for the first time since he'd come back to Whispering Pines, he felt ready to do just that. With one last glance at Thomas, Mason stepped outside the cabin and into the quiet of the forest. The air was growing colder now, but there was a strange sense of warmth that filled him. The Mustang was out there somewhere waiting for him to follow, and Mason knew that whatever lay ahead, he wasn't alone anymore. The Mustang would guide him just as it had guided his grandfather, just as it had guided Thomas. And somehow, in that moment, Mason realized that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The next few days passed in a blur. Mason found himself caught between two worlds, the reality of caring for a ranch that had fallen into disrepair and the looming weight of his promise to Thomas. His days were spent repairing the barn, patching leaks in the roof, clearing overgrown brush, and tending to the land. But no matter how hard he worked, the pull of the cabin in the woods, the cabin where Thomas waited, remained constant. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life had been set on a path that was somehow out of his control, that everything was connected in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. It wasn't just the land that needed mending. It was his heart, his connection to the past, his sense of who he was. And the truth was, he didn't have any answers, not yet. Mason had learned in the army how to push through the pain, how to ignore the gnawing emptiness that lingered when the work stopped and the silence crept in. But out here, on the ranch, in the wide open spaces of Wyoming, the silence was louder than anything he had ever known. It wasn't the silence of peace, it was the silence of loss, of something long broken, and Mason didn't know how to fix it. His grandfather, Samuel, had carried that weight alone for so many years, and now Mason found himself carrying it too, the weight of promises made long before he was born. He didn't know if he could carry it, but he was sure as hell going to try. One morning, as Mason was making his way down the old trail that led to the creek, he heard a sound, a low, rumbling whinny. The sound cut through the stillness of the morning, sharp and clear, and Mason's heart skipped a beat. The Mustang, the wild creature that had somehow found him, that had led him to Thomas, was back. Mason turned toward the sound, his boots crunching on the gravel as he made his way toward the edge of the forest. And there, standing in the clearing, was the Mustang. It stood still, its dark eyes fixed on Mason as if waiting for him to approach, waiting for him to understand. Mason hesitated, unsure of what to do, unsure of what this meant. He had never been one to believe in signs or omens, but the Mustang was different. There was something in the way the horse held itself, in the way it watched him, that made Mason believe it wasn't just an animal. It was something more, a guide, a protector. The Mustang didn't flinch when Mason took a step forward, didn't shy away when he closed the distance between them. Instead, it stood there, calm and unbothered, as if it had been waiting for Mason to make his move. Mason reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the horse's mane. The warmth of the animal's coat sent a rush of comfort through him, and for the first time since he had returned to Whispering Pines, he didn't feel so alone. The Mustang stood beside him, its presence a quiet reassurance, as if it understood everything he was going through, everything he was struggling with. "You're still here," Mason murmured, half to himself. The horse's ears flicked toward him in response, and Mason couldn't help but smile. Maybe, just maybe, this wild creature had a purpose, just like he did. For all the confusion, for all the uncertainty that had come with taking over his grandfather's ranch, the Mustang had been there to lead him, to show him that he wasn't walking this path alone. The days that followed were filled with more of the same. Work on the ranch, the quiet solitude that had become Mason's constant companion. But the Mustang remained, always close by, always watching from the edge of the forest or grazing peacefully in the corral. Mason couldn't deny the strange pull it had on him, couldn't ignore the feeling that somehow the Mustang was guiding him toward something he hadn't yet fully understood. The days were growing colder, the crispness of fall creeping in, but the sense of purpose that had begun to take root in Mason felt like a warm fire inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. There was a chance for healing here, for both himself and the ranch. It wasn't just about fixing fences and barns, it was about fixing what had been broken for so long, the land, the memories, the promises. Then, one afternoon, as Mason was repairing the barn roof, he heard the unmistakable sound of a vehicle approaching. He glanced up, wiping the sweat from his brow, and saw the sheriff's truck coming down the long gravel driveway. Sheriff Jim Blackwood was a familiar face, a man who had known Samuel for years, a man who had watched over the ranch long before Mason had returned. Mason set down the hammer and wiped his hands on his pants as the truck came to a stop. Blackwood climbed out, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel as he made his way over. The sheriff was a stocky man with salt and pepper hair and a face weathered by years of Wyoming winters. He had a no-nonsense air about him, but there was kindness in his eyes that Mason had come to appreciate since his return. "Mason," Blackwood said with a nod, "thought I'd stop by, see how you're holding up." Mason nodded, wiping his hands on his jeans again, trying to hide the fact that the sheriff's visit made him uneasy. It wasn't that he didn't like Blackwood. He did. It was just that every time the sheriff showed up, it felt like a reminder of how out of place he was, of how much work there was to be done. But there was something in the sheriff's presence that felt like stability, a reminder that there was still a connection to this place, still something worth saving. "Been busy?" Mason replied, offering a half-smile. "Lot of work to do." Blackwood's eyes narrowed slightly as he glanced around the yard, taking in the sight of the overgrown grass and the sagging barn roof. "Looks like you're getting a lot done. But don't overdo it. You know, Samuel always said that this place had a way of sucking the life out of you if you let it." Mason chuckled softly, but there was a hint of sadness in it. He knew the sheriff was right. Samuel had worked the land for years, had poured his sweat and blood into it. But there was only so much one man could do, only so much one man could carry before the weight became too much. And now, that weight had been passed on to Mason. Blackwood seemed to sense the change in the air, the quiet sorrow that Mason couldn't shake. He cleared his throat and motioned toward the barn. "I've got something for you," he said, pulling a small weathered envelope from his jacket pocket. "Came in from Cheyenne. It's about your grandfather's military service. I thought you might want to see it." Mason took the envelope, his fingers brushing against the rough paper. There was something about the way Blackwood handed it to him, like he knew it wasn't just a letter. It was a piece of Mason's history, a link to the man who had raised him, who had lived and breathed this land, and who had kept his own secrets buried for years. Mason's pulse quickened as he tore open the envelope, pulling out the contents. Inside was a letter from the Veterans Affairs Office, along with a few documents detailing Samuel's military service. There was mention of his time in Vietnam, of his bravery, and a medal that Mason had never known about, a silver star, earned under fire, earned for acts of heroism that had saved the lives of others. The weight of it settled over him like a heavy fog. Samuel had never mentioned it. He had never spoken of the medal, of the sacrifices he had made. Mason's hands trembled as he read the words on the page, each line revealing a new layer of his grandfather's life, of a man who had fought for his country, for his brothers in arms, and who had never sought recognition. Mason realized, with a growing sense of awe, that Samuel had carried so much more than he had ever let on. Blackwood's voice broke through his thoughts. "You know, Samuel was never one to boast about his service, but he was proud of you, Mason. Always talked about you when we'd sit and have a drink. He wanted you to know in case something happened. He didn't want you to feel like you had to carry the weight of his past." Mason nodded slowly, his throat tight. He didn't know what to say. He had always known his grandfather was a quiet man, a man of few words. But this was different. The legacy Samuel had left behind wasn't just in the ranch or the land. It was in the people he had touched, in the sacrifices he had made, and now it was Mason's turn to carry that legacy forward. As Mason stood there, the letter still in his hands, the Mustang appeared again, its dark eyes watching from the edge of the trees. The presence of the horse was both grounding and mysterious, a reminder that Mason wasn't alone. The journey ahead would be difficult, no doubt, but with the land, with the ranch, and with the men who had served alongside his grandfather, Mason knew he could carry on. The Mustang, in its quiet way, had already shown him the way, and now it was up to him to follow. Mason's life, now tangled with the ranch's broken fences and neglected barns, felt like it was slowly starting to take root in something deeper. The days that followed Sheriff Blackwood's visit were full of long hours of physical labor, but it wasn't the exhaustion that weighed on him. It was the silence that came with being the sole caretaker of a place that had once been filled with life, laughter, and stories. It was a silence that reminded Mason of everything his grandfather had been and everything that had been lost. But there were still things to fix, still tasks that needed to be done before winter fully set in. The barn needed a new roof, the well needed repair, and the broken fence lines had to be mended before the livestock could be secured. Mason didn't mind the work. It kept his hands busy and his mind occupied, but as the days wore on, he found himself thinking more and more about the letter from the Veterans Affairs Office, about the Silver Star, and about the man his grandfather had been before he had arrived at Whispering Pines to raise him. There were questions swirling inside him, questions about Samuel's past that Mason didn't know how to ask. But with each repair he made, with each nail hammered into the wood, the realization set in. This wasn't just about fixing a ranch. This was about piecing together the fragments of a man's life, a life that had been carefully hidden from view for so long. And now Mason had to figure out how to reconcile the man he had known, the man who had raised him, with the soldier his grandfather had once been. The Mustang, which had seemed to materialize from the shadows of the forest like an omen, remained by his side. It was almost as if the horse understood Mason's internal struggle, as if it was waiting for him to finally acknowledge the path laid out before him. Each morning, Mason would find the Mustang grazing peacefully near the corral, its coat shining in the early sunlight, its dark eyes watching him, as if silently urging him forward. And though Mason had no idea where the path would lead, he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward the horse, toward the ranch, and toward the pieces of the past that he still didn't fully understand. One afternoon, as Mason worked on the fence at the edge of the property, he heard the sound of tires crunching over gravel. He stood up, wiping his brow, and saw a familiar figure in the distance, a truck pulling up near the barn. It was Daniel, Thomas Winters's old comrade, the man who had served with his grandfather in Vietnam. Mason had met Daniel briefly at the hospital, but this was different. This time, Daniel was here to visit. Mason's heart tightened slightly as Daniel climbed out of the truck, his gait slow but determined, his weathered face a map of years spent battling not just the elements, but the ghosts of the past. Daniel had always been a fixture in the memories his grandfather shared, but Mason didn't know much about him beyond the brief stories he had been told. Now, standing on the porch of Whispering Pines, he couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to hear the stories firsthand, to learn about the man his grandfather had been before he became the quiet, reserved rancher who had raised Mason. "Mason," Daniel called out as he approached, his voice strong despite the years of wear. He extended a hand, the grip firm but rough from years of hard labor. "I thought I'd stop by, see how you're settling in." Mason took the hand and shook it firmly, feeling the calluses in the old man's palm, evidence of a life lived in service and struggle. "I'm getting there," Mason replied, stepping aside to let Daniel in. The two men stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the surroundings, the long driveway that led up to the ranch house, the weathered barn that had once been a symbol of prosperity, the overgrown garden that had long since lost its charm. Daniel's eyes swept over the land, and Mason could tell that the old man was taking stock of more than just the property. "It's been a while since I've been here," Daniel said quietly, his gaze distant as he looked toward the mountains that loomed in the distance. "Last time I came, Samuel was still here, still trying to make this place work, even though he was getting on in years. He always had a way of making it feel like nothing was impossible." Mason nodded, feeling a pang in his chest at the mention of his grandfather. It was still hard to believe Samuel was gone, even after weeks of being back at the ranch. There was so much Mason hadn't known, so much he hadn't understood. He had always been the quiet one, the one who didn't ask questions, who took things at face value and never pressed too hard. But now, with the weight of the ranch on his shoulders, the unanswered questions about his grandfather's life and service began to gnaw at him. He wanted to understand. He needed to understand. "Can I make you some coffee?" Mason asked, his voice softer than he intended. He turned to lead the way inside, but Daniel held up a hand. "Let's take a walk," Daniel suggested. "I've got something to show you." The two men walked together along the overgrown paths that led to the edge of the property. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the ground, and the air was crisp, the first hints of winter creeping in. As they walked, Daniel spoke of the old days, of the time when Samuel and Thomas had been inseparable, their bond forged in the hell of war, and sustained by years of loyalty and brotherhood. Daniel spoke of the nights they had spent on the front lines in Vietnam, of the fear and the fire, the things that haunted them long after the war was over. He spoke of the bond they had shared, of the way Samuel had saved him when he thought he was done for, how Thomas had patched up wounds that should have been fatal. There were no pretensions in Daniel's words, no pride, no boastfulness, just raw honesty, the kind that came from years of facing down death and carrying the scars that came with it. "You know," Daniel said, breaking the silence that had fallen between them, "Samuel was a man who carried a lot of weight, more than anyone knew. He never asked for help, never wanted anyone to know what he'd been through. But he did it anyway. He carried it all, for you, for the ranch, for his country." Mason looked at the ground, taking in the weight of Daniel's words. "He never talked about it," Mason said quietly, more to himself than to Daniel. "Never told me anything about his time in Vietnam. I didn't even know about the Silver Star." Daniel nodded slowly. Samuel wasn't one to brag about his service. He believed in doing what needed to be done and moving on. But that Silver Star, Mason, that wasn't just about his bravery. That was about the men he saved, about the men who didn't come home, and about the promise he made to them. Daniel's voice grew soft as he spoke, the weight of his memories pressing down on him. He promised to carry their stories, to make sure they were never forgotten, and he did that, right until the end. Mason felt a lump form in his throat as he listened. He had known his grandfather as the stoic man who had raised him with love and discipline, but this was a side of Samuel that Mason had never understood. His grandfather had been a hero in a war, a soldier who had fought not just for his country, but for the men beside him. And yet, when Mason had come home, Samuel had buried it all. He had kept it locked away, never letting it show. "What do I do with all of this?" Mason asked, his voice cracking slightly. "How do I honor him, honor everything he did, when I didn't even know who he really was?" Daniel stopped walking and turned to face him. There was a kind of sadness in his eyes, but also something else, a deep understanding that only came from having lived through the same trials, the same trauma. "You honor him by doing what he would have done," Daniel said, his voice quiet but firm. "You take care of this place, Mason. You keep it going, and you make sure the men who fought beside him are never forgotten." Mason nodded, the weight of Daniel's words sinking in. There was so much more to this ranch, to his grandfather's legacy, than he had ever realized, and somehow Mason knew that it was his responsibility now to carry that legacy forward, to protect it, to honor it. The Mustang, the land, the stories, it all seemed to fit together in ways Mason couldn't yet fully understand. But he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone in this. He had the men who had served with Samuel, and he had the land, the ranch, to remind him of everything that had come before. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Daniel turned to Mason. "There's something I want to show you," he said, his voice soft but urgent. "Something your grandfather left behind." Mason's heart raced as Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. The envelope was old, yellowed with age, and sealed with wax. "Your grandfather wanted you to have this," Daniel said, handing it to Mason. "It's something he wrote, something he wanted you to know." Mason took the envelope, feeling the weight of it in his hands, the seal cold and firm beneath his fingers. As he opened it, his eyes fell on the letter inside, Samuel's handwriting, neat and precise, yet filled with a depth of emotion that Mason had never seen before. The letter was short, but every word felt like it was written just for him. "Dear Mason," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I'm no longer there to tell you myself. But I want you to know that I've always been proud of you. I've always been proud of the man you've become. You don't need to carry my burdens, son. You don't need to carry the weight of the past. But know that this ranch, this land, has a history, and it's a history that's been shaped by men who fought for each other, who gave everything for each other. And now it's your turn to carry that forward. I believe in you, Mason. You've always been the one to carry the light when everything else seemed dark. Don't forget that. Don't forget who you are." Mason's hand trembled as he folded the letter back up and tucked it into his jacket. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace, a sense that, no matter what, he was where he was meant to be. The weight of the past didn't have to crush him. It was his to carry, yes, but not alone. And the Mustang, always waiting in the distance, watching from the edge of the trees, was his guide, his companion, as he walked the path his grandfather had set before him. Mason stood at the edge of the clearing, the words from his grandfather's letter still echoing in his mind. The weight of Samuel's last message lingered with him, heavy in his chest, like the final piece of a puzzle that had been scattered for years, finally coming into place. He had always known there was more to his grandfather, more to the ranch, more to the men who had fought side by side with him in Vietnam. But the truth had always seemed like a shadow, just out of reach, only partially visible. Now that truth was finally revealing itself, piece by piece, as Mason began to unravel the legacy that had been left behind. It wasn't just about taking care of the land or fixing the broken fences. It was about honoring the past, preserving the stories of the men who had bled and fought for each other, and ensuring their sacrifices were never forgotten. But even as Mason felt this new sense of purpose, it wasn't without its struggles. There were days when the weight of the responsibility was almost too much to bear, when the silence of the ranch seemed unbearable and the ghosts of the past seemed to whisper in every corner. Mason was out by the barn, working to replace the rotting beams of the roof, when he heard the distant sound of an engine. At first, he didn't think much of it. It could have been anyone. Another neighbor coming by, a delivery truck, or maybe even the sheriff checking in. But as the sound grew louder, Mason felt a pang of unease stir in his gut. He wasn't expecting anyone, and for the first time in weeks, he found himself wishing for the solitude that had become his companion. But the truck appeared anyway, kicking up a cloud of dust as it pulled down the long driveway. Mason wiped his hands on his jeans and squinted into the distance, watching as the truck slowed to a stop by the porch. The door opened and a man stepped out, a tall, weathered figure who looked like he had spent a lifetime under the harsh sun, his face lined with age and experience. Mason's heart skipped a beat when he recognized him. Daniel, the old soldier who had been a part of his grandfather's past, who had served with him in Vietnam, and who had been part of the bond that had held the soldiers together long after the war had ended. Daniel had visited before, but this time was different. This time Mason knew there was something more to their conversation, something deeper that needed to be said. Daniel had been quiet, reflective in their last meeting, but there was an urgency now in the way he stepped out of the truck, in the way he moved toward the porch with a sense of purpose. "Daniel," Mason called, his voice steady but uncertain. Daniel stopped and turned, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Thought I'd swing by," he said, his voice gruff but warm, the same way it had always been. "I know you've got your hands full with the place, but there's something we need to talk about." Mason felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know what it was, but something in Daniel's tone made him nervous. He'd spent the past few weeks getting used to the quiet, to the solitude of the ranch, and now it seemed as if everything was about to shift again. He stepped down from the ladder and walked toward Daniel, wiping the dust from his palms on his shirt. "What's going on?" Daniel paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the land around them as if taking in the full scope of the ranch. "It's about your grandfather," he said, his voice quieter now, more serious. "There's something you need to know, something he wanted to tell you, but he never had the chance." Mason's stomach twisted. The thought of his grandfather's secrets, of things left unsaid, had been gnawing at him since he arrived at Whispering Pines. He had never asked questions before, never pushed for answers, but now the silence felt suffocating. "What is it?" Mason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel met his gaze, his expression hardening with the weight of the conversation ahead. "Your grandfather wasn't just a soldier, Mason," he said, his words measured, heavy. He was a man of great courage, yes, but he was also a man who carried a lot of pain. Pain he never let anyone see. He carried the weight of what happened in Vietnam, things he never shared with you, with anyone. But he wanted you to know. He wanted you to understand that the land, the ranch, this place, it's not just about work, it's about healing. Mason took a step back, his mind racing. Healing? From what? What are you talking about? Daniel looked at him, his eyes filled with a deep sadness that Mason hadn't seen before. From the war, from what we all went through. Samuel didn't just fight in Vietnam, Mason. He lost a part of himself there, and when he came back, he thought he could bury it all, thought he could put it behind him, but he couldn't. Not really. Mason's heart thudded in his chest. He didn't talk about it. He never told me anything. I know, Daniel replied quietly, and that's part of it. He didn't want you to carry that burden. He didn't want you to see him as the broken man he was after the war. He wanted you to remember him as the man who raised you, the man who loved you. Mason felt his throat tighten. He had always known his grandfather was different after the war, but he hadn't understood the depth of the change. Samuel had kept everything locked away, buried deep inside, hoping to protect Mason from the scars that still marked him. But now, with Daniel's words hanging in the air, Mason realized that his grandfather had been carrying those scars for a lifetime. Daniel stepped closer, his voice growing softer. Mason, your grandfather never forgave himself for what happened. He thought he could make it right, thought he could redeem himself by protecting this land, by keeping the promise he made to his brothers in arms. But he didn't have the time to heal himself. That's why he wanted you here, to finish what he started, to take care of this place and to take care of the men who fought beside him. Mason nodded slowly, his mind struggling to process the gravity of Daniel's words. He had thought that returning to Whispering Pines was about finding peace, about reconnecting with the past, but now it felt like something much bigger, something more important. What do I do now? Mason asked, his voice barely audible. Daniel's gaze softened, and for the first time, Mason saw a flicker of hope in the old man's eyes. You keep going. You honor his legacy, Mason. You take care of the land, take care of Thomas, and you make sure that the stories of the men who served with him aren't lost. Samuel believed in you, he always did, and now it's your turn to believe in yourself. With those words, Daniel turned and started to walk toward the truck, leaving Mason standing at the edge of the clearing, his thoughts swirling. The Mustang, ever present, stood nearby, its eyes following Mason, waiting for him to make the next move. Mason felt a strange calm settle over him. He didn't have all the answers, didn't know exactly how he would honor his grandfather's legacy, but he understood one thing. The road ahead wasn't just about fixing fences or mending barns. It was about healing the land, healing the past, and healing himself. And in that moment, with the Mustang watching him and Daniel's words still echoing in his ears, Mason knew that he wasn't alone. He was part of something bigger, something that transcended time and war, something that had been built on brotherhood, loyalty, and sacrifice. The next few days brought more hard work, more repairs to the barn, more fencing, more long hours spent under the Wyoming sky. But as Mason worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that the pieces were finally falling into place. He wasn't just fixing the ranch, he was fixing himself. The weight of his grandfather's legacy, of the promises made and the burdens carried, was heavy, but it was no longer something he feared. It was something he was ready to carry. As the sun began to set on the horizon, casting long shadows over the land, Mason stood at the edge of the property, looking out over the fields that stretched toward the mountains in the distance. The Mustang stood nearby, its coat glowing in the fading light. For the first time in a long time, Mason felt a sense of peace wash over him. The work wasn't done yet, not by a long shot, but for the first time since he'd come back to Whispering Pines, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The past was still there, lingering like a shadow, but now it was a part of him, woven into the fabric of this place this ranch, and the men who had come before him. And with that understanding, Mason knew that he would carry it forward. He would honor his grandfather's legacy, and he would make sure that the stories of the soldiers who had fought together, who had bled together, were never forgotten. This was his path now, and he wasn't going to walk it alone. The Mustang, as if sensing Mason's resolve, whinnied softly and began to move toward the forest, its coat blending with the shadows of the trees. Mason watched it for a moment before turning back to the ranch house, his mind already focused on the work ahead. There was still so much to do, but now, for the first time, Mason felt ready to face the past, to honor the men who had come before him, and to ensure that their legacy would never fade. The road ahead was long, but it was his to walk. And with the Mustang as his guide, Mason knew he would find his way. The days that followed Daniel's visit passed with an unusual sense of urgency. The repairs on the ranch were progressing, but there was a deeper shift within Mason. The idea of continuing Samuel's legacy, of carrying the weight of the stories that had been hidden for so long, felt like a heavy cloak draped over his shoulders. He had always felt a sense of duty, but this was different. It wasn't just about taking care of the land. It was about preserving the essence of what had come before him. It was about honoring the brotherhood that had been formed in the trenches of war and carried through decades of unspoken memories. As the days stretched into weeks, Mason found himself caught between the past and the present, trying to reconcile the quiet man who had raised him with the warrior he had never fully known. Each morning, as the sun broke over the horizon and the Mustang appeared in the distance, Mason felt a pull, an unspoken invitation to follow, to step into the role his grandfather had envisioned for him. And yet, there were moments when doubt crept in. Could he really honor his grandfather's wishes? Could he truly live up to the legacy of men who had given so much, men who had fought in a war that seemed so distant, yet still held sway over everything? One morning, as Mason was working on the barn roof, hammering nails into the wooden beams, he heard the familiar sound of a truck pulling up the driveway. He glanced up, squinting into the bright morning light. This time, it was Sheriff Blackwood. The sheriff had been a quiet presence on the ranch since Mason's return, offering help when needed, but mostly keeping to himself. He had been a constant in the background, a reminder of the community that Mason was slowly reconnecting with. As Blackwood climbed out of his truck and approached the barn, Mason wiped the sweat from his brow and set his hammer down. There was something in the sheriff's stride, something different about the way he carried himself today. It was as if the weight of the conversation they were about to have was already pressing on him. "Mason," the sheriff said as he walked up, his voice low but steady. He had a look in his eyes that Mason couldn't quite place, a look that spoke of something serious, something that required Mason's full attention. "We need to talk." Mason nodded, feeling a tightness in his chest. He had a sense that whatever was coming wasn't something he would be prepared for. "What's going on?" Blackwood hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the landscape before settling back on Mason. "It's about Thomas," he said, his voice gruff. "He's not doing well. His condition's worsened. The hospital's doing what they can, but it doesn't look good, Mason." The words hit Mason like a punch to the gut. He had known Thomas's condition was fragile, but hearing the sheriff speak of it so bluntly brought the harsh reality crashing down on him. Thomas, his grandfather's old comrade, the man who had fought beside him in Vietnam, was slipping away, and Mason couldn't help but feel the weight of the promise he had made to his grandfather. The promise to bring Thomas home, to bring him to Whispering Pines, to give him the peace he deserved. But what if it was too late? What if Thomas couldn't be saved? What if the promise was too big for him to fulfill? Mason swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. "Where is he?" he asked, his voice tight. "Still in the hospital, but I thought you should know," Blackwood said, his gaze softening. "I know you've been busy with the ranch, but I think it's time you go see him, Mason. He needs to know you're there. He needs to hear from you." Mason nodded slowly, the weight of the sheriff's words sinking in. He had been running, avoiding the deep emotions that came with reconnecting with the past. But now it was time to face it. Face Thomas, face the promise he had made, and face the man who had been part of his grandfather's life for so long. The path was no longer a matter of fixing fences or barns. It was about fixing the bonds that had been broken, about mending the ties that tied them all together, across decades of war, sacrifice, and loss. "I'll go," Mason said quietly. He paused, looking out at the land that stretched before him, the land his grandfather had cared for, the land that had witnessed the lives of men who had given everything. He turned back to Blackwood. "But I'll need your help. I can't do this alone." Blackwood nodded. "I'll be here, Mason. You're not alone in this." With that, Mason climbed into the truck, the weight of the task ahead pressing on his chest. As he drove toward the hospital, the landscape outside the window seemed to blur. The mountains, the trees, the ranch, all of it faded into the background as his thoughts turned inward. The promise he had made, the weight of his grandfather's wishes, the memories of the men who had fought for each other, everything seemed to be coming to a head. But Mason knew that it wasn't just about fulfilling a promise anymore. It was about confronting the past, about facing the truth of what had happened and finding a way to move forward. When Mason arrived at the hospital, he found the atmosphere inside to be quieter than usual. The sterile smell of the hospital was overwhelming, and the silence felt thick, suffocating. He walked down the long hallways, the sound of his boots echoing off the tile floor. He felt like an outsider in this place, a visitor in a world that didn't belong to him. But he pushed forward, heading toward the room where Thomas lay. The door to the room was cracked open, and Mason hesitated for a moment before pushing it open all the way. Inside, Thomas was lying in a bed, his frail body covered by a thin hospital blanket. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, and yet there was a quiet strength in his eyes that Mason had always admired. Thomas's gaze shifted to him as he entered, and for a brief moment there was a flicker of recognition, a flicker of the man who had once been a soldier, a medic who had saved countless lives. "Mason," Thomas whispered, his voice raspy, weak. "You came." Mason walked to the side of the bed, his heart heavy in his chest. "Of course I came," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your family." Thomas's lips curled into a faint smile. "Family," he murmured. "You're just like Samuel." The words hit Mason harder than he expected. Thomas had always spoken of Samuel with such reverence, with such love, and now to hear those words directed at him, Mason felt the weight of the legacy his grandfather had left behind, the legacy that was now his to carry. "I'm here now, Thomas," Mason said, his voice firm but filled with a tenderness that surprised him. "I'm here to take care of you, just like I promised." Thomas's eyes fluttered shut for a moment, and Mason feared that he had lost him then. But when Thomas's eyes opened again, there was a clarity in them, a sense of peace that Mason hadn't seen before. "Samuel always kept his promises," Thomas whispered, "always kept us together, even when the world tried to tear us apart." Mason nodded, his throat tight. "We're still together, Thomas," he said softly, "and I'll keep that promise." As the hours passed, Mason sat beside Thomas's bed, listening as the old man spoke in fragments, stories of the war, of the bond they had shared, of the things they had seen, the things that had haunted them both. Thomas spoke of Samuel, of the bond they had formed during their service, and of the way Samuel had always put others first, even when his own body and mind were breaking down. Thomas's words were raw, unfiltered, and as Mason listened, he understood. He understood the weight of the past, the burden that Samuel had carried for so long, and the way it had shaped the man who had raised him. "I never thought I'd see this day," Thomas said, his voice weak but filled with a deep sense of relief. "But Samuel would have been proud of you, Mason, proud of the man you've become." Mason didn't know how to respond. He wasn't sure he was the man his grandfather had hoped he would be. He wasn't sure he was ready to carry the weight of all that had been lost. But sitting there with Thomas, listening to the stories of men who had sacrificed everything, Mason realized something. He didn't have to be perfect. He didn't have to have all the answers. He just had to keep going. He just had to honor the promises that had been made, to carry forward the legacy that had been passed down to him. "You're not alone," Mason whispered, the words coming more easily now. "We'll carry this together, all of us." And as Mason sat by Thomas's side, the weight of the past no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a bond that would carry him forward, just like the Mustang had led him to the cabin in the woods, just like Samuel had led him to this moment. The road ahead was uncertain, but Mason knew he wasn't walking it alone, and that in itself was enough.